Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for ToxTime. My name is Grace Della Pena, Account Manager with USDTL. Today's presenter is Dr. Joseph Jones, Chief Operating Officer with USDTL. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Joseph Jones.
Thank you, Grace, and welcome to everybody for this edition of ToxTime. And so today we're going to talk about drug testing fingernails and comparing that with hair a little bit. And so let me share my screen and let's get started. So if I can get a thumbs up, if we can see the screen and if everybody can hear me okay. All right, thumbs up. Thank you, Grace. Okay, so hair and nail testing, what's the difference? So over the past few years, nail testing has been gaining popularity as an alternative specimen type. And the structure is keratinized protein, just like hair, which is different than like bone and antler. It's more like hoof and horn. And so it's a suitable next wave of specimen type for the forensic toxicology to take advantage of. But before we can, where's my clicker? There we go. And so before we can talk about fingernail testing and what's the differences, let's review really quickly the main routes of incorporation of drug and drug metabolite into hair. And so first and foremost is environmental exposure. If you're in a room where drug is being used, handled, manufactured, distributed, etc., that environment will become contaminated and then it will contaminate your hair. Think about fiber evidence in like a criminal investigation. And so this is very different than what we talk about with cigarette smoke, which is actually unintentional ingestion when we're talking in that realm. But here we're talking the physical transference of drug from the environment, being smoke settling on the hair, what have you, settling on the hair, binding to the proteins and pigments, and that drug is available to be harvested and analyzed immediately. Route number 2 is the sweat and the oil from the skin or the scalp surrounding each hair follicle. And so those fluids contain drug and drug metabolite, very similar to urine. And so as those fluids bathe the hair shaft, it deposits the drug and drug metabolite, works its way into the nooks and crannies, binds to the proteins and pigments, and is available to be harvested and analyzed. We begin seeing that maybe a few hours after dose, not to be confused with being positive a few hours after dose, but we start to see that a few hours after dose as that sweat and oil is contains the drug and drug metabolite. Route number 3, and what most people think about with a hair drug test, is that as the blood travels through the hair root as the hair is forming, it will deposit drug and drug metabolite. And then as that portion of hair emerges past the scalp line, which takes about 2 weeks, then that portion of hair can be harvested and analyzed. Now, these are 3 very different modes of incorporation, and they're superimposed on top of each other. So it's an overlapping and very complex picture. But what we know is that on average, at the back of the head, most people's hair grows at average ½ inch per month. And most of that hair is in an active growth state. And so when we receive the hair at the laboratory, we identify the root end, we cut it at 1.5 inches, we discard the excess. And so the detection window is bracketed by the average age of that hair, which is up to approximately 3 months. Some drugs last a little shorter in hair. Some drugs may last a little longer. This is a nice happy medium when you're trying to do panels and do a breadth of testing on each specimen. So now can we use nails? Obviously, yes, because we're doing it. And some of you guys joining us here today have already dipped your toe in the nail testing pond. And so we can do it, but yes, there's differences. So one of the biggest variables in hair testing is the pigment. And so the darker the hair, the tighter the base drugs bind. The acidic drugs like marijuana and ETG, it has no effect. And so this is kind of an interesting comparison when we look at some data when we get to our case studies at the end. Fingernail generally does not have pigment. There are people that have pigment, but there are not many. And when the pigment's there, it's not much. And so we can't say that there's no pigment that would affect the the binding of drug inside the fingernail. It's definitely much less than we see with hair when you look at the whole demographic. I kind of conceptualize this as that if you take a population that you test hair and they've got all different colors of hair, I kind of think of fingernails as normalizing to light brown hair. And if you think about it in that way, you'll start to see some comparisons emerge when you're doing testing for your facility. Another structural difference is that nail is in a formation called beta pleated sheet. And so, of course, you know, it's not like fuzzy on the ends of our fingers, it's a hard plate. And so that's because it's the beta pleated sheet. Now, because of that, we have a couple of differences. Environmental exposure seems to not pick up as well on fingernail because it's a little harder. Number two, it's a single surface, except for the distal edge where you have the two surfaces. But if you think about someone in a room where someone's smoking crack, you've got 360-degree surface area of each hair that's exposed to the smoke, whereas with the fingernail, it's only two. And we tend to wash our hands more than we wash our hair. So before we can get into how drugs are incorporated in the hair, let's take a real quick peek at the anatomy. I know we got some doctor friends on here, so this is probably going to be a little simple for our doctors and nurses, but we should review this together. And so the piece that you're familiar with, and if you can see my mouse moving around, we have the nail plate. And so this is the obvious thing that we see with the nail. And then the piece that we clip off is called the distal or the free edge. And underneath the nail plate, we have the nail bed. Now that nail bed is rich in capillary blood flow, which is going to come up in just a minute. And then back over here to the far right is called the germinal matrix. And this is where the fingernail begins. It's formed in this tissue and begins its growth. So how are drugs incorporated in the fingernail? Here we are. Number one, just like with hair, we got environmental exposure. If you're in a room where the drug is being smoked, handled, manufactured, distributed, that drug will get on your fingernail. The fingernail is porous to a degree, and it will bind in there and will be preserved for later for testing. We start to see that immediately. Now, the sweat and the oil surrounding the skin, a little less impactful with nail than we see with hair, but it's there nonetheless, especially when you start talking about toenail testing. Because if you got your feet in socks and shoes, then that nail is exposed to sweat for long periods of time. Whereas the hands, that's not really the deal, but it's a factor that we have to keep in mind. Route number three, and very similar to hair, is that where the nail forms, just like where the hair forms, that germinal matrix will incorporate drug and drug metabolite into the fingernail. And then as that portion of nail grows out to the end, which takes 4 to 6 months to get to the end to be clipped on average, then that's what we have. But now we got this one additional mechanism that we don't have with hair. And this is quite interesting in that as the nail grows out, it grows in thickness. Okay. And so this is important. And so as that nail grows out, it grows in thickness as material is being added from underneath. Okay. And so this was reported in this paper. I have a review paper that I have for your reference at the bottom here. But the first indications of this that I've seen in the literature, and there probably are others maybe earlier, but there were nail fungicide medications that were oral tablet form. And they begin seeing this showing, you know, and the concentration of this drug in the nail is important. Not enough, it doesn't kill the fungus. If there's too much, it probably has some other bad side effects. So you need to be in a certain concentration in the nail, not necessarily in the blood. And what they found to their amazement was that, hey, wait a minute, in a week or so, we're seeing this show up in nail clippings. And so they were thinking that they had to do shavings, which if you've ever done a shaving collection, it's totally miserable. But they started seeing this, the drug from oral administration showing up inside of a week or so. And so this is kind of where they started looking at, well, how is that happening? So you have the skin, the sweat and the oil for the cuticle that we have to be concerned about. Also, that capillary blood flow, as that nail emerges past the quick so that you can cut it, it's got that short history when it was back on the quick and it was drawing analytes in from the capillary blood flow in the nail bed. So this makes for a really interesting specimen type in that we don't have to do the shavings, but we can do simple nail clippings. And that clipping potentially has a drug history of the entire trip from the germinal matrix all the way out to the distal edge. And so that's why we say that the detection window for fingernails is up to approximately 4 to 6 months. Health conditions can speed up and slow down the hair. There can be some drugs that people take for various conditions. There can be negative health situations that can cause the nails to slow down or speed up. And so we have to be aware of that and be lenient with the interpretations. But by and large, we can count on an up to 4 to 6 month detection window. So again, with hair, as with hair, these are all overlapping. We can't tease them out and separate them out. The fingernail grows about 3 millimeters a month. So as I mentioned before, it takes about 4 to 6 months for that nail to travel across the entire nail bed and be available for clipping. And so one of the factors that makes a nail an interesting specimen type is that it's keratinized matrix, as we mentioned before, but it's somewhat thicker than hair. And so on average, hair is about 100 microns, whereas with fingernails average about 400 microns. So once that drug and drug metabolite is embedded into that fingernail, it's protected from being either reabsorbed by the blood in the nail bed or being extracted out as it diffuses and fills in throughout that nail. And so this is an interesting concept when we start looking at the acids, because we see a very different pattern with marijuana and the ETG than we do, say, with some opiates and with cocaine when you look at acids versus look at some bases. So this makes for a really nice comparison when we get to that. So another question is how much nail do we collect? This one's a tough one. Sometimes it can be difficult. You know, the irony of this is that I work at a lab that promotes nail testing. And if I had to be in a compliance program, I'd be in big trouble. I've treated my nails since I was 13 years old, and I've not been able to stop. And getting a nail sample on me would be tough. We could go with toenails, but that would be, 12 to 14 months detection window. But the fingernails, it can be a challenge, just like a bald man can be a challenge for a hair test, right? So all of these specimen types have their own advantages and disadvantages and limitations. So that's clearly a limitation for fingernail. Is someone that bites their nails, it's kind of tough to get a specimen. But how much nail do we need? We need 100 milligrams for most tests. And if we're doing like some really extended panels, we need 150 milligrams, which that can get a little tough to get. The quarter is 2 millimeters thick. And if we get a clipping that is as thick as a quarter, on average, those are about 10 milligrams. And you get one of those from all 10 fingers, there's your 100 milligrams. And so, and you can see you can set up the little collection foil in this a little boat shape instead of the crease like you do with the hair, and you can pop the clippings in there. Had this come up as an aside, I had this come up a couple of weeks ago with a client of ours. You're clipping the nails and one of them clicks over and was on the shirt of the guy. He reached over and grabbed it and put it in the foil. Now the guy's claiming that, it went on the floor or whatever, or the desktop, and that's where it got contaminated. And so I would advise during collections, if one gets away from you, it's just gone. And I wouldn't try to recover it and rescue it just because of perception. I don't think that you're going to get enough exposure at that point for it to be positive. And but it's all about perception when we start doing litigation support on these results. So talking about litigation support, are these results, do they hold up in court? So far, so good. We've been challenged on numerous occasions. And so, it comes down to, with this type of testing, it's really abstinence monitoring. There's so many variables we cannot backtrack and determine time, dosage, and frequency. So if we were trying to say that you were using your Vicodin as prescribed or you're abusing it, we could get in trouble if we testify on that because, the data is just not there for that. And there are so many variables in there. But, that's therapeutic drug monitoring. We're doing abstinence monitoring for our court-ordered testing and our program testing. And so it's like, is it there? Is it not there? And so this makes it a much simpler interpretation. And if it's there, why was it there? There has to be a reasonable explanation. And so the fundamentals of these results being accepted in court is there chain of custody, which with all the samples that we do here, there's a chain of custody from collection through analysis all the way to the destruction at the end. Is there confirmation testing? All of the testing in our laboratory goes through initial testing. We push out the negatives at that point, and then any presumptive positives go for a confirmation test, typically by GCMS, GCGC, MSMS, or LC-MSMS. Say that 3 times quick in a row. But all of these mass spectrometry methods are appropriate for the drug classes that we're looking for in the specimen type. So chain of custody, screen, and confirm. Also, I'd like to add that we are here to help you with these cases. Nobody's expecting you to be an expert on what we do, just like I can't do y'all's job. And so this is how we collaborate and help each other. And so we're there for support with business record affidavits, letters of interpretation, litigation packages, and interpretation or testimony when it comes to it. Either, which is all by video now, but at some point we may do some live ones again. But we're there to help you out and interpret these results. So what do we see with our fingernails here at USDTL? And so if you were at our last ToxTime, we talked about child guard hair. And that was like, the positivity rates were like crazy high, right? They're like 80% or something, 70% for the methane, which we've seen this big increase over the last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years. And we're seeing that across the board. I was just recently attending the College on the Problems of Drug Dependency conference this week. And this was a big part of the discussion as well, is that this next wave is the stimulants is coming back. So be ready. But with our nail testing, this is not general demographics. We generally do not participate in the workplace market. These are like intake for people coming in for treatment where, they should be positive because that's why they're coming in for treatment. Or we're looking at a family court where there's, it's kind of gone past the first couple of gates and it's gotten ugly, or there's an accusation or there's a previous history. So this is an enriched population that we look at by and large at USDTL. This is kind of what we specialize in. But you can see that, we way more meth amp than cocaine, which, I think several years ago that would have been a little different. And of course, marijuana is king. Everybody likes their weed. And so that's up into 20%. And, that's just only going to get bigger as the legal landscape on marijuana changes across our country. So at any rate, this is kind of what you can expect if you send nails into our laboratory week in and week out. Now, here's the fun part. We've got some case studies that we can look at. And so the first one is, there was a research paper. I have the citation here at the bottom, Journal Analytical Toxicology. And so this is Dr. Rapera Miller and Dr. Goldberger, Dr. Cohn, Dr. Joseph. These are all people who I respect immensely in this field, stand on their shoulders kind of a thing. But they had this interesting paper back in 2000. This is a long time ago, right? It's 20 years ago, 21 years ago. But they were looking at 2 of these base compounds, on the alkaline end of the spectrum, cocaine and codeine, with codeine being a representative from the opiates. And so we can see here that for participant A, in the hair, we had 6,800 picograms per milligram, and the codeine was 1,900. But if we look at the fingernail, so we've got 820 for the cocaine and 120 on the codeine. So this is a really good example of the difference between what we expect with head hair and fingernail, in that the head hair probably was somewhat darker. And so we're getting more showing up there, less showing up in the fingernail. Doesn't mean that you're going to get a difference in deposit rates. It's just that the numbers are going to be different. There could have also been the difference between like controlled dosing versus someone who's been using throughout the entire year. And so that could account for some of the differences. And if you look at the ratio between like the fingernail and the head hair, you know, the ratio of fingernail to head hair for cocaine is much higher than the ratio of codeine to for fingernail and head. So one's greater than 10% and the codeine is less than 10%, probably accounted for maybe the mechanism of intake, how everybody's smoking it, you know, handling it, ingesting. I don't know how they were ingesting it. And also you've got like the alkaline pKa is probably a little different for these two drugs, and that will further account for the differences. So interesting study on one participant. Here's a second participant, saw the same thing. So we saw in cocaine, they had 2,200 in their head hair with 700 in their fingernail. And then for codeine, we had 1,800 in the head hair and 170 in the fingernail. And so this is kind of a pattern that we see day in and day out at USDTL. Occasionally, we do get matched pairs of hair and nail, and not all the time because it's expensive, right? And so when we do get a chance to see these matched pairs, this is kind of what we see when we're talking about the bases. Now, this is interesting, the next slide. And so here, we're looking at ETG. And so this is slightly acidic. It's not alkaline. So this was a paper that we published following the execution of a phase 2 National Institute of Health grant back in a little bit after 2010. And so we worked with a group up at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and we were able to get 529 matched pairs. And when we, and of course they got the drinking history, and Dr. Berger from that institution wrote this really nice paper. If you want a copy of it, I can share it with you. It's open access. But at any rate, what she showed us in that paper was that the fingernail had like 2.5 times the amount of ETG than the hair did. So here we got the average nail ETG concentration was 75, whereas the average hair concentration was only 30. And so this is completely opposite from what we saw on the previous slide when we're looking at the bases, cocaine and codeine. Again, with marijuana, here's another paper that we published about 8 years ago, where we had 60 matched hairs, fingernail and hair, again from the same source in Milwaukee. And there we had 5 times the carboxy THC in nail than we did in hair. So here we're seeing where we all know that detecting marijuana in hair is pretty tough, right? Just look at the cutoffs; it's 1,000-fold lower than the rest of the drugs. And so that's you know, 0.36 was the average cutoff on these routine users of marijuana. And so it's kind of nice that when you have an alternative specimen type, that it's going to preserve a couple of the more difficult analytes to detect in hair. You do fingernail, they show up nicely. And so for ETG, Dr. Berger determined that instead of the 30 that the Society of Hair Testing suggests as their cutoff for chronic ingestion of alcohol, she suggested in fingernail it should be like 54. And so this is kind of good information to hang your hat on when you're having to interpret some of these very difficult cases, because you know you're getting all kinds of stories. You got the lab report, and you get I didn't do it, and all of that. And so before I do the summary, I do want to kind of mention one thing. Dr. John Jackson, thank you for being here today, Dr. Jackson. I saw your question about the GEM scale, and so the GEM scale is a nice piece of equipment to have at the collection site, so that when you do the collections, you can weigh it right there. They're inexpensive, and you know what you got before you send it out. But no, we don't require that. And the second question that we had, and I know I'm getting into questions early, sorry, Grace, was about the false positive. And so I wanted to take a few minutes on that before I hit my summary. And so fingernail is an additional alternative specimen to urine. And so it's got a whole laundry list of advantages and disadvantages. We went through a few of them here today. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is that they are different. They are different. They give you similar results, but there are differences. Now, the accuracy of these are the same as any other test. They're in a chain of custody. We have an initial test, generally immunoassay. They're confirmed by mass spectrometry. So false positive, we have a lot of measures and checks and balances in place to mitigate that. Now, but drug testing is a human endeavor. And so I've done this long enough not to sit up here and preach to everybody that no one ever makes a mistake. And if anybody ever does, they're fibbing. Mistakes happen. And that's why we have the last line of defense for a donor. And that is we retain these specimens for 1 year for the purpose of retesting, either here at our laboratory at another referee laboratory. I see cases all the time where the donor refutes the result, which it's their right to do that. Joe, you got it wrong. That's not me. Okay, fine. I'll take your refutation seriously, but we have to dissuade the insincere disputers because in our demographic, everybody's innocent, right? And so most of you guys deal with that more than I do. So we have to put some skin in the game. But the retest is the appropriate mechanism to go with because the specimen that was positive is the specimen that has to be overturned before we can talk about recollecting a sample. And I see over and over again donors and clients going in the wrong direction and wasting their time, their money, and the specimen and resources and all of that when they go for recollected specimens, which are not going to help with the interpretation, or like they send them off for DNA analysis and destroy much of the sample. Maybe they can't have it retested because now they did DNA analysis. When a donor refutes the test, the first thing that we should do is respect that opinion and offer the opportunity to have that specimen retested, either at our laboratory or another laboratory. So I just kind of want to get those before we dove in today. There was two of these questions. I was sitting in the Q&A. I wanted to bring those up before we got into some other questions. But here in summary, nail is keratinized protein similar to hair. It's got some slight structural differences, so they're not identical. Nail offers reduced issues with pigment, and so it's kind of more sensitive for acidic drugs. We think, and just anecdotally, it seems to be less sensitive for environmental exposure testing, although if you don't have any hair, this is kind of like your next choice. It offers us a long window of detection. And so that's a dual-edged sword. Sometimes that 4 to 6 months is too long. We know they were using back in February. We need to know more about the last couple of months. So in that case, nail wouldn't help you out. But at any rate, the long window of detection, be aware of that. And analytes are added in 2 dimensions, so you can use clippings instead of scrapings. And so with that, we come to the end of our presentation here. And so I want to point out a few things before we leave here is that I've had clients tell us that they appreciate the amount of information that we have on the website. There's not as much on fingernails as there is with hair, but that's just the nature of the literature at this time. We're trying to add to that all the time. But please go to our website. You can see the website page down in the bottom in a little super dude's cape here. And please visit that and rummage through, and any material you want to pull down, share with your colleagues or your staff, please feel free. And we've got posters and there's some news articles. Please feel free to share that. Also, please, if you're not familiar with the offerings in fingernail, please feel free to shoot us an email or call client services at the number below, and they'll be happy to tell you what panels we have available and point you in the right direction and make sure that you've got collection instructions and all of that in order to execute a fingernail collection. Also, if you've never ordered a nail test, client services or your sales account manager will be happy to show you that. Last but not least, if you've never done a hair, you've never done a sample with USDTL, please reach out to the email or the phone number below, and our team will be extremely happy to help you get started.
Subscribe to our channel to see more videos like this.